My friend Michael was throwing a house party. I arrived early to help set things up. I secured a spot to sleep in his parents' room, meaning I could drive to the party and drink without having to worry about driving home. His parents obviously weren't home for the night. Most of our close friends in our friend group came, plus a bunch of Michael's friends who I didn't know. The party was fun. At midnight, everyone screamed Happy New Year and cheered their drinks. After that, people slowly started circulating out, and the party started to quiet down as people went to either other parties, bars, or home. The later the night got, the more it became just the closer friends staying behind, until it just turned into a chill drinking session in the living room. This went on late into the night. It was likely 2:40 a.m. when the last of everyone who wasn't sleeping at Michael's house was gone. As it quieted down, we started hearing this occasional sound. At first, we didn't know what it was, but it soon started to sound like a creaking sound. It was dismissed as a sound from the fridge or something at first, which I know sounds stupid, but house appliances often make weird noises. It was just Michael, me, and Lloyd. Lloyd was falling asleep on the couch already. It was reaching that time where we were just going to go to sleep. However, eventually, we got so bothered by the noise that we had to search. We went to the kitchen, and it wasn't coming from in there. We realized when we were close to the basement door that it was coming from downstairs. Michael opened the door, and we heard this creaking sound. "Go check what it is," I said. He kept saying, "No way." Then he called down into the basement, "Yo, who's down there?" The creaking stopped, and we never heard it again. After a solid minute of waiting at the top of the stairs, we agreed to go down together. We both grabbed knives, drunkenly thinking that was a good idea, when in reality, we were so drunk we probably only hurt ourselves with them. We got to the bottom of the stairs and looked through the entire basement. It's not huge, it just has a couch, TV, a bar, a table in the corner, and various old pieces of junk. It was pretty messy at the time. The first thing we did was search any possible crevice for someone who could be hiding. Then we tried to figure out what could have been making that sound. I noticed a rocking chair, and so I went up to it, sat in it, and then started rocking in it. It made the exact same creaking sound we had been hearing. Michael and I looked at each other. I stood up, and so did every hair on my body. I don't think we ever ran faster than we did when we ran up those stairs and slammed the door shut. We tried to come up with any logical explanation, but there was none. He kept the basement door locked for days until his parents came back. There was no living soul down there, but something was moving that rocking chair. That rocking chair used to belong to his grandma, who passed away forever ago, and it's just something his mom held on to for sentimental reasons. I can't say I've ever experienced anything resembling the paranormal before this, nor since then. It still sends chills down my spine. This past New Year's was my and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year, we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle, and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin, and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and you needed to take stairs on the back side of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snow plowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. So we unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire, playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped, and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snow plowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask if they or any of their friends had stopped by. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host, but we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point, it was past 10, and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime and spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back. This time, we actually drove up the driveway towards the top of the hill. Part of the driveway, though, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were any more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up the driveway, then reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked all around the property. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw the footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry, and we would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up, and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little bit shaken up and very embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in a hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie with champagne. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 2 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like I said, we woke up with all of the lights on, and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew that we were here and that they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. Once again, we sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if someone was throwing something up onto it. I was losing my absolute mind when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search everything. Then, soon, we heard banging on the door. It was the police, and we were okay now. At the door were two policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around the snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer who did the initial check on the property. The officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked, and again, there were no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the officer said the road conditions were too dangerous at that time of night. I looked at the officer who had to come out to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, locking all the doors again, and we tried to sleep. The next day, we were leaving. While we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I just wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise that we heard at 2 a.m. That's when I had the realization that it was the heater all that time. It was just the heater in the garage making this noise. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and then walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but also incredibly grateful for the same reason. A couple of years ago, when I was in college, I went to a New Year's Eve party. For a little bit of background, I'm a female and lived on campus but went home for winter break. My parents' house was only about an hour away from campus, and I had a few friends who went back to school early. There was going to be a New Year's Eve party at one of my best friend's houses on campus, so I went back there for it. First, I went back to my college apartment and then arrived at my friend's on New Year's Eve at about 5 p.m. I was one of the first people there, and we just kind of hung out until the other people came over. For a long time, it was a lot of fun, and a lot of my college friends were there, but like many college parties that I went to, things soon became a little bit out of control. A lot more people started to show up at like 10 p.m. or so. The college that I went to is a very large university. I'm not sure how many people attended, but probably well over 25,000 or 30,000. The house soon had a lot of people that I didn't even recognize in it. I was still having a good time, though, until this one guy came up to me. He was a man who looked to be in his 29-year-old and had a tall, somewhat muscular build. Now, he wasn't jacked or anything, but he also wasn't fat, he was just big. He came right up to me, seeming drunk, and started asking me questions about myself. We talked, but not long into the conversation, he asked if I wanted to leave with him. I said no. He kept asking, and I soon walked away. It was very crowded, and the guy followed me all around just about wherever I went. By that point, it was probably midnight, and I decided to just leave. I walked through the crowd of people and found my friends. I told one of them about the guy who was following me, and then I said I would be leaving. I tried to point him out in the crowd, but at that point, I couldn't find him. Then I said bye to my friend, and I left. When I first got outside, I thought that the guy had finally given up. I didn't see him, and I was walking back to my apartment, which was only a few blocks away. But when I started to walk down the street, I heard somebody leaving the house and turned around to see the guy. He yelled at me, asking me where I was going. I told him that I was going home, and he started to walk towards me. Now I was concerned that he was going to follow me all the way back to my apartment. I tried to just ignore him and walk away and hoped that he would stop, but he didn't. I heard him walking down the street after me, trying to catch up. I walked as fast as I could without running. When I made it to where I had to turn, he was still behind me. He was a long way back, so I tried to lose him. I cut through a random person's yard and then went through their backyard. Once I got through there, I cut into the next block over and then walked the other way down the street. This ended up working, and when I got off of that street, I no longer saw him. I was able to make it back to my apartment, and I even checked outside when I got back to make sure that he didn't somehow follow me. Everything was fine, and I went to bed shortly after. The next day, I went back to my parents' house because classes didn't start for college for about 2 more weeks. After driving back home, I arrived sometime in the early afternoon. It was then that I saw I was added on Snapchat by someone. It was a guy named Basil. I didn't automatically assume that it was the same guy from the night before. My college was so big, and I knew a lot of people and didn't have all their snaps. To be honest, I got added by people on almost a daily basis, plus I didn't even recall this guy telling me his name the night before. But after the guy added me on Snapchat, he said hi to me, and I asked him who he was. He responded, saying we met last night, remember? That's when I realized it was the same person. Still, I asked him to clarify. He said he was at the party and then described himself. When he did, I blocked him. I wanted nothing to do with this guy because, after all, he had tried to follow me home. After that, he did not contact me, but the story doesn't end there. That night, I was at my parents' house in my bedroom. I noticed out of my window a car parked on the side of the road out front. It was kind of weird because our neighborhood was quiet and everybody's houses had long driveways with plenty of space to park. Plus, the car was parked like 20 feet from our driveway. It was a very typical-looking sedan, but I couldn't see if anybody was inside or not because it was too far away. I decided to get up and walk over to the window to get a little bit better view. When I did, literally right when I got to the window, I saw the driver's door open. A man got out, and at first, I had no clue who it was. But then the guy came into our driveway and walked along the side of it. When he got a little bit closer, I realized it was the same guy. This really blew my mind. At first, I was not even near campus. I was at my parents' house an hour away. Why was he here? I watched him walk all the way up the driveway, but he didn't go into the front yard. Instead, he went around the side of the house and out of my view. It seemed as though he was going into the back. I hurried out of my room and found my parents. I told them about the guy, and then I called the police. We carefully went to a window in the back of the house and looked out to try to see the guy. It was really dark back there with many opportunities for places for him to hide. We didn't see him, but we knew that he was back there somewhere. For the next few minutes, he remained hidden. Then the police arrived. They came to the front door, and we let them know that the guy was probably hiding in the backyard. Our property was searched, and the man was located. He tried to run away but was caught before making it off of our property. It turned out that the guy didn't even go to my college. He had found my location through the brief time that he had me on Snapchat because my location was on. This is an experience that is still almost unbelievable to me to this day. I feel lucky that I noticed the car and saw the man get out. If I didn't, I would not have known that it was his car or that he was hiding in the backyard. What he planned to do, I'm not sure, but I'm glad that we called the police. When I was 12, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up and from there, they divorced. My mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone and my mother was currently out of state. Now, this didn't worry me as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that they had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was habitually leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town. I knew most of the people, if not by name then by face, enough to wave and have a small chat with. I had never been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on the USA channel, and I had most of the lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid, but because at 12, I wasn't concerned with the electricity bills or even saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party or people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off of the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen and leads directly into the living room where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off of the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started, as slowly and as quietly as I could, to make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman from playing hide and seek in the dark many, many times with my friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything, it was just like they were moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing in the doorway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream, however, I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and I ran down the hallway. I believe the only reason I wasn't grabbed by now is because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children would do when they're afraid. I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and I ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time as it was right off the side of the couch. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked and the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked, if they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it certainly wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking and on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. That after he had stopped, though being under my bed gave me no feelings of being secure. I didn't come out from under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it and therefore be waiting for me on the other side. It was also several feet off the ground as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified, for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I awoke the next morning to daylight. The fear of what had happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why. Scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there, I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out this kind of window was a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully as I was not, and still am not, the most coordinated person. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house. That's when I noticed that the back door was wide open. Scared but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning instead of pitch black night, I walked back up the steps and started peering inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, meaning no terrifying man leering at me basically, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe at how stupid this could have turned out, and I wish I would have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help. But thankfully, no one was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, and anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterward. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door. I had left it open in case I needed to escape, and I noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, and checked all the windows and front door. Then I called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker, who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on. It was December 31st, New Year's Eve. My friend Harry hired me to watch his dog, Bailey, for the weekend while he was out of town for the new year. I'm 34, he's 26, so I don't have that same urge to go out and party for New Year's Eve like he does. I was more okay with making some money and taking it easy for the night. New Year's Eve was on a Saturday. He left for the city early in the day. When I got there, he'd be back Sunday night. He left me with very basic instructions: just feed him and walk him twice a day, and keep him off the furniture. Bailey is a very small husky mix. I'm not sure what else she is, but she's about a third the size of a regular husky, and she's very quiet and well-behaved. Hence why Harry was okay with me watching her instead of a dog sitter. I brought a backpack which contained my laptop, charger, toiletries, and a change of clothes for Sunday. Harry and I don't go way back. We met through mutual friends and had started going out occasionally on the weekends ever since. I would be sleeping in the spare bedroom of his house on the futon. Throughout the day, I just did stuff on my laptop and played some of Harry's video games. Later in the night, I invited my girl over with Harry's permission. His response was, "You better not in my bed," a way of jokingly saying yes, she can come over. She said she'd be getting out of work after 12, but then she'd come straight over. Harry's house is about half an hour from us, so my girl Ratty wouldn't be getting there until late. I had to kill the time alone with Bailey, watching movies until then. We were in the living room, and Bailey was by my feet. It was probably 9 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I went to answer the door, and it was a girl at the door. She looked about 30. She had a hoodie on and was holding a jacket. She introduced herself as Harry's girlfriend and said she left something here that she needed to grab. I offered to grab it if she wanted, and she said no, it's okay, she knew where it was in his room. I said okay, that's fine, and let her inside. She went straight upstairs to Harry's room and slightly closed the door behind her without latching it. I right away texted Harry, "I didn't know you had a girlfriend." She was in there for quite some time until she came back out, still holding her jacket. She came back down the stairs, thanked me, and was going straight for the door. I tried to stop her for a quick conversation, saying, "How long have you guys been dating?" And she said, "Too long," then laughed as if making a joke. I laughed too, and then she said, "Have a good night." I was a bit surprised by the interaction, but what I gathered from it was they had probably just recently broken up. Now I started to worry that maybe I shouldn't have let her in since Harry hadn't answered my text yet. I called him a few times before he picked up. He was out with his friends in a loud setting, so he could hardly hear me until he went outside to talk. I told him his girlfriend just came by to grab something, and he was completely bewildered at what I was saying. "Who are you talking about?" he said. I responded, "She said she was your girlfriend, I didn't get a name." He said in a yell, "You know I don't have a girlfriend." What did she look like? I started to feel really stupid just about now. I described the girl, and he said he had no idea who this could have been. I then proceeded to explain to him that she went upstairs to his room for a few minutes, then came back down. This was when he started freaking out. He told me to go up to his room now and check if she stole anything. Of course, I didn't know what was in his room beforehand, so he had me check for specific things, which all appeared to still be there. He tried hard to figure out who it could have been and said he'd call me back after he made some calls and sent me some pictures of different girls. Understandably, this was putting a damper on his night. I could tell he'd already been drinking, so I felt awfully stupid for letting some random girl into the house. He started sending me screenshots of different girls' Instagram accounts. None of them resembled the girl who came in. When I said no to all of them, he went silent for an hour. Then he texted me randomly, "I think I know who it was. Make sure she doesn't come back." I didn't ask any further questions. I responded, "Okay, my bad," and left it at that. Clearly, Harry was going through some serious girl drama, or so I thought. I watched the ball drop alone, not that I really cared about the new year or the ball drop at all. Later that night, Radif finally made it over, and so we hung out in the living room together. I told her what happened, and she was shocked. But then a freakish coincidence happened. Bailey lifted her head and looked at the front door, and then there was a knocking at the door. Whoever it was didn't ring the bell. There was no shot I was opening it. I called Harry a bunch of times, but he didn't pick up. He was wasted and didn't even feel his phone vibrating. Ratty and I stayed quiet, and eventually, whoever it was went away. I was honestly unnerved now. Surely it was in connection to whoever that girl was earlier. Maybe it was even her again. Either way, I didn't want to get involved any further in what was going on. After this, we decided to migrate to the spare bedroom where we'd stay for the night on the futon. We had a movie on as we laid down, and I held her. We fell asleep in this position and woke up at some unknown hour in the night, which I later found out was less than an hour after we fell asleep. I woke to Bailey's howling. She was in the room with us. Ratty woke up after me. Bailey was at the bedroom door, with her tail wagging, howling. I whispered, "Bailey, shush." She looked at me and then came over, but she stayed staring at the door, now growling, making unhappy whimpering sounds. Then there were footsteps outside on the wood floors. We heard what had to be at least 2 pairs of footsteps tiptoeing to the door, and then the doorknob twisted. By force of habit, we had the door locked, thankfully, and a girl's voice said, "Harry." I looked at Ratty and signaled for her to stay quiet. That girl was not alone. Another light tap at the door, and then the girl's voice said, "Who's in there? This is Harry's house." I made the decision to say in a loud voice, almost a yell, "The cops have been on their way for a few minutes now, just so you know." The girl said, "Who are you?" I didn't bite. I whispered to Ratty to actually call the police, and she did. The entire time she whispered into the phone. I said loud and clear, "I dare you to do something, because by the time you do it, the cops will be running through the front door." I heard a whisper on the other side of the door, then multiple pairs of footsteps walking away from the door. We stayed in the room waiting for the cops to get there. Since the front door was left wide open by those people, the cops came right in. The house was clear by this point. I gave my entire recount of the story and then called Harry multiple times until he finally picked up, still sounding pretty drunk. One cop talked with him on the phone for a few minutes while I sat with Ratty speaking with another cop. After all this was said and done, the accepted assumption was that there was a key in Harry's room taken by that girl from hours before. This was a pretty messy situation since Harry couldn't just come all the way home this late. He practically begged me to stay the rest of the night. I had Ratty go home. I stayed because I felt responsible for letting that girl in the first place. I stayed locked in that room the rest of the night with Bailey. I literally wedged a chair against the front door, some half-ass attempt at keeping them out if they decided to return. By morning, though, it seemed that they didn't return. Harry came back earlier that day than originally planned. I'm not going to air out any more private information to the internet than I already have, just in case anyone who knows him can figure out this story is about him. But he did tell me who he thought the girl was, and the story behind it proves that men have to be careful too with the women they choose to interact with. That girl and whoever was with her's intention of breaking in wasn't to steal anything evidently, which is the scariest part. He changed his locks ASAP. I can't even imagine staying in that house if I were him after this. However, it's been a year and as far as I know, nothing has happened unless he's keeping more to the story he told me a secret.